Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, we're going to be covering everything you need to know for Mists of Tirna Scithe on Mythic difficulty. I'm going to break down the scary trash mobs, all of the boss encounters, and any other tough stuff along the way. The dungeon is located on the left side of Ardenweald, right next to the Rootholm flight path. Each dungeon in Shadowlands has Covenant-specific effects, and in this dungeon there are several, so it's very beneficial to have a Night Fae in your party for this one. Before the first boss room, there are mushrooms that can be activated for a small bonus. Green, increase your stats for 10 minutes. This is the best one and you should take this almost always. Red ones give a max HP buff that could be useful but generally aren't as good as the green ones. After each boss, there are also depleted anima seeds. Night Fae members can activate these seeds, creating an updated respawn point. These are almost necessary for any group just learning because the walk back can be very long. Lastly, there's a small shortcut covered by overgrown roots that can only be removed by Night Fae members at the beginning of the dungeon. Now that we got all that out of the way, we can start talking about the dungeon. This first area is probably the toughest, so be careful right out of the gate here. Using the Night Fae shortcut at the beginning can save some time, so ideally you'll have a Night Fae. Spike Claws leap to random players and then hit everyone nearby for a decent amount of physical damage as well as a stacking bleed. Try to use AoE stuns and mob displacement if possible to keep them together to nuke down. When they die, the Spike Claws put a curse on everyone within 30 yards for 30 seconds. That increases damage taken by 10%. This also stacks, so make sure you're dispelling whenever possible. Druss Soul Cleavers are incredibly dangerous mobs that cast Soul Split on the tank. This does a large amount of magic damage and also increases the damage they take by 20% for 8 seconds, so be sure to dispel this immediately. Ideally, you have a non-healer that can dispel the curses, while the healer focuses their dispels on this magic effect or else the tank is going to be hit hard. Harvesters are range casters with 2 abilities. Spirit Bolt deals a large amount of magic damage to whoever is targeted. Harvest Essence is a long channel that deals less damage but heals the harvester for all of the damage done, so this is the highest priority kick if you're looking to save time. The toughest mob in this area is the Tirnan Villager. These have an absolute ton of health, however they become friendly at 20%, so you don't have to bring them down to 0. The villagers cast Bewildering Pollen, a frontal cone that deals a large amount of damage if you're hit and also disorients anyone by 4 seconds. This is easily telegraphed, although can be hard to dodge in tight spaces if you're trying to sneak through the area and not pull any additional packs. They also cast Overgrowth, stunning a random target and creating a seed around them until it's destroyed. The seed has a low amount of health and can be almost immediately broken out if the target is in some ground effects from the team nuking down the Spike Claws. Since this is a very dangerous area, it's a good idea to sneak by as many mobs as possible. Using out-of-combat CCs like Sap or Imprison, or even Priest Mindsoothe can prove helpful here. All of the packs are a mix of the 4 mobs mentioned earlier. Here is the Night Fae Mushroom Room I mentioned as well, located just before the first boss. Only members of the Night Fae Covenant can open the roots, however once opened, everyone in the party can click on the mushrooms to get the buff. Before you engage the first boss, you have to deal with 2 Bough Breakers. These mobs occasionally cast Bramble Burst, springing branches from the ground that slow you and deal a light amount of damage. At 50% health, they cast Furious Thrashing, dealing large amounts of physical damage to your entire party for 6 seconds. It's best to focus them down one at a time so they aren't both thrashing together, but with a coordinated group, it might not be a bad idea to keep them even and then use all your defensives and healing cooldowns during that time. After the Bough Breakers are dead, you can finally pull the first boss, Ingra Maloch. This is a council-style fight with 2 bosses, Ingra and Droman. You have to continuously DPS down Droman, the big tree, in order to make Ingra vulnerable again. Once you bring the tree to 20% health, it will stun Ingra and increase damage he takes by 200% for 12 seconds. It's ideal to save your cooldowns for this moment since the damage amp is so large. After the stun wears off, Droman the tree will heal back to full again and you start the cycle. After about 30 seconds in a phase, Ingra will cast Repulsive Visage, which fears all players, and then he shrouds himself in darkness, reducing all damage taken by 80% and also starts pulsing damage to the party. The goal is to drop the tree low to stun the boss before this phase, but depending on difficulty and your group's damage, you may not be able to achieve this. During the fight, Ingra will occasionally cast Spirit Bolt, which deals heavy damage to the tank and should be kicked. The tree will also cast spells against you while active. Tears of the Forest are just swirlies that spawn over the room, dealing initial damage and also leaving a puddle. Droman also has the same bewildering pollen frontal cast that the other trees earlier do as well. When you're leaving the first boss room, don't forget to activate the depleted anima seed to update your graveyard. The walk back is already really long. This next area is one of my favorites, the Mistveil Tangle. This is a maze in which the true path is revealed by the symbols hidden in the mist. Each room has 4 symbols, and each symbol has 3 different attributes: flower or leaf, filled or empty, and circled or not. One of the 4 symbols will have an attribute that is different from all the others. For example, 3 of the symbols will be flowers, and the 4th one will be a leaf, so that means the leaf shows the correct path. It might seem a bit complicated at first, but once you grasp the idea, it's pretty easy. I made a video on this specific part of the dungeon. I'll leave a link in the description for you to check out if you want more help. A quick tip, in the very first room, the Mistcaller will always go in the right direction, so you can skip the game on the first room and just follow the Mistcaller. Now that we've brushed up on our preschool matching again, we can move on to the rest of the dungeon. While you are navigating the mist, you have to completely clear the room before you can move on to the next. The mist won't open until the room is clear. If you guess wrong, you and your entire party will be teleported back to the beginning of the maze. Mistveil Defender's main ability is Spear Flurry. They deal pulsing damage in a frontal cone while channeling this. It's a good idea to stun these when possible, especially when they are enraged. When their allies die, they gain 1 stack of enraged, increasing damage done by 50%. Mistveil Tenders, on the other hand, only have a healing cast, Nourish the Forest. Every 15 seconds this must be kicked or it will heal all nearby allies. The Stingers cast Anima Injection, leaving a debuff on a target that deals nature damage for 6 seconds. If not dispelled, the target will explode for a large amount of damage, hitting any nearby players as well. The healer needs to dispel all of these within that 6-second window whenever possible. Mistveil Stalkers are deceptively dangerous. Their only ability, Bite, teleports them to a random target and deals a very high amount of physical damage and inflicting a bleed for 12 seconds. During my testing, this was one of the hardest hitting abilities in the dungeon, and although you can't interrupt it, you want to stun or lock down the cast whenever possible. If you do lock it down, it won't recast it again for 15 seconds. Mistveil Shapers are also important mobs to lock down. Their main ability, Bramblethorn Coat, gives themselves an absorb shield, while rooting players for 8 seconds and dealing heavy amounts of damage, so it must be interrupted. Lastly are the Guardians. They have a long wind-up ability called Bucking Rampage that deals damage to everyone around them in a circle. It's fairly easy to sidestep. You can potentially run into one of 3 mini-bosses in the mist as well. The Mistveil Matriarch can be a bit of a pain for the tank, so be careful if you run into this one. Radiant Breath is a frontal cone that disorients players similar to the trees earlier in the dungeon. Pools of Radiance is a cast that cannot be stopped and places a pool under the Matriarch, healing itself or any players inside for 4% per second. Drag it out as soon as possible, else it can heal very quickly. Be careful of the tank hit though, Shred Armor, which deals a large amount of damage. This isn't particularly dangerous for the tank, however, if the tank is out of range, it will hit any random nearby player instead. When you're tanking this, be sure that you're kiting the mob slowly to drag it out of the pool while still staying in range to take the hit. Gorge Gullet is the second mini-boss. The big frog is significantly easier to manage. Poisonous Secretion hits enemies around in a circle with initial damage and a damage over time effect, but it's pretty easy to step out of. Otherwise, the frog jumps around the room, dealing damage to anyone who decides not to move out of it. It also has a tank hit similar to the Matriarch. This one, however, is a frontal, so make sure it's not pointed at your allies. Lastly is Mistveil Night Blossom. Like the others, there's a heavy tank hit called Triple Bite that is a frontal that also leaves behind a poison debuff. Poison Discharge sends swirlies around the room that have to be dodged. This one's pretty easy to handle too, but can still take some time because of how much health it has. Once you make your way through the mist, you'll run into the Mistcaller. This is a really fun boss. I think one of the best designed dungeon bosses of the expansion. Throughout the fight, it will cast Dodgeball, indicated by an arrow that gets pointed towards every player. These are easy to dodge, however it can get hectic during later stages of the fight. Freeze Tag creates a Vulpin that fixates on a random player for 14 seconds. If you come into contact with the Vulpin, it explodes, dealing large amounts of damage and freezing you for 8 seconds. Because of the frequent dodgeball casts, getting hit by the Vulpin almost always leads to death, as you can't get out of the way of the dodgeball when frozen. Patty Cake is a tank mechanic that must be interrupted by the tank, nobody else. If you fail to interrupt it, you'll be disoriented for 5 seconds and take heavy damage. At 70, 40, and 10%, the boss phases, creating clones of itself. During this phase, the boss will take 99% reduced damage, so there's not much point in hitting it. Each one of the 4 illusions will have a symbol above its head, and just like navigating the maze, you must find the odd one out and kill it. Until you do, the entire party will be taking increasing pulsing damage, so find it and focus it down quick. If you destroy the wrong one, it's game over, and the entire party takes lethal damage. Considering all of the damage outside of the illusion phase is avoidable, this is a great time to use defensives and healing cooldowns. Once you deal with the last illusion phase at 10% health, the boss should be nearly dead and the fight is basically over. Jump down the waterfall to head to the next area. If you have a Night Fae member, be sure to activate the second depleted seed, giving you an updated graveyard. This area is a bit easier than the first 2 for the most part. The only concern is that the passageways are narrow and you can easily fall off. There are also several diseases here, so not having a party member that can dispel disease is a bit of a problem. The Spine Maw Acid Gullets have only one ability, Volatile Acid. This puts a circle around a random player, dealing nature damage to them and everyone else inside for 8 seconds. The damage is pretty light, however try not to stay stacked up, especially if there are more than one. Staghorns are high priority mobs to lock down because they have 2 different defensive abilities. Stimulate Resistance gives them a magic absorb shield, and Stimulate Regeneration causes all allies to gain large amounts of health for 8 seconds. Later on you'll run into Larva. These small mobs are easy to handle, however their death triggers a decomposition pool that deals area of effect damage in a puddle around them. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but can take up a lot of space on these narrow walkways. Speaking of narrow walkways, the Gorgers shoot out acid globules on the ground, indicated by green swirlies. If you're hit, you'll take a large amount of damage and get knocked pretty far back. It's quite easy to get knocked off here, so it may be a good idea to stop these casts. Although you can interrupt it, if you disrupt it in some other fashion, it won't recast for 15 seconds. Lastly is the Spine Maw Reavers patrolling the skies. These mobs can be hard to see because they're in the air, but they're quite easy to pull on accident, so be careful if they jump in halfway through a pull. Their main ability is Stinging Assault. They charge to a player, dealing initial damage and applying a damage over time disease effect. This effect can stack, so if you're charged by multiple Reavers, be sure to get the Dispel off or at least use a defensive ability. The third and final boss of Miss is Tred'ova. It's a good idea to have most major cooldowns, including Bloodlust, going into this fight, because the faster you kill the boss, the easier it gets. Throughout the fight, Tred'ova casts several abilities. Mind Link attaches a random player to all of their allies, dealing damage to all of them until they run 40 yards apart. This might not seem too difficult, but with all the other mechanics going on, it can cause some chaos and end up spreading your group out, making it very difficult for the healer. Tred'ova spawns larvae throughout the fight, using accelerated incubation. These larvae fixate on random players and leave the same decomposition pool you saw earlier behind them. This room is quite big, so the tank just needs to move the boss over if an area gets too crowded in pools. Occasionally the boss will also summon individual parasites that latch onto a player, incapacitating them. As the fight goes on, these parasites will get stronger, and at the end they'll even mind control you. This cast isn't a big problem though because it can be interrupted, so be sure to stop this every time you see it. The last part of the fight is Acid Expulsion. Tred'ova shoots acid at every player, doing a large amount of damage if you stand at the location it hits. It's easy to dodge the first time, however each subsequent time, the boss fires even more acid, at your location as well as each location you dodged previously. What makes this hard is that Tred'ova is doing this to everyone. This means on the 4th or 5th acid cast, there will be over 20 different projectiles in the room. The key to the fight is to manage the first few casts so that they are not a big risk to your allies. At 70 and 40% health, the boss phases into an intermission and casts Consumption. This ability gives her an absorb shield, does pulsing damage to all party members, and also creates a ton of blue swirlies all over the room. Once you break the shield, you can interrupt the cast, but I actually think it's best that you don't. Here's why. While the boss is channeling, it doesn't use any of its main abilities like Mind Link or Acid Expulsion. The consumption phase is a bit annoying, but it does give you some free time to damage the boss without having to worry about the other difficult mechanics. This fight is a DPS race to down the boss before the acid and larva pools overwhelm you, so an opportunity to hit the boss for free shouldn't be passed up. Do your best to keep the acid pools grouped as long as possible while dealing with the other mechanics and slam the boss. Once the boss is dead, the dungeon is over. Collect your loot and go again. That wraps up my dungeon guide for Mists of Tirna Scithe. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or tips that you think I missed, drop them down in the comments for people to see later on. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming out with guides for each mythic dungeon and raid boss. Happy keying!